Our fascination with horror never ends, and one of the most terrifying stories humans have been confronted with is the presence of reptilian humanoids on Earth. There are a myriad of books speaking of their influence over Earthlings, and today we'll be looking at the history of these beings with Len Kasten, author of Alien World Order. And welcome, Len. We saw each other last time over Project Serpo, right?
Yes.
And this one is wow, it's intensely well researched, but we also have testimony in there from some very common threads. Some know Stuart Swerdlow, for example, whom I've interviewed also. But a lot of this is coming from the early part of the story is coming from Robert Morningsky.
Yes.
And we're going to get right into that and talk about who he is. So first of all, let's talk about Robert Morningsky and how he came into this story and the nature of the beings that he's speaking about.
Yes, his grandfather was really the key person who was involved in the rescue of an alien from a craft that crashed in the desert on the reservation.
Mm-hmm.
I believe
New
it was
Mexico,
New Mexico.
In 47, before Roswell.
Before Roswell,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And his grandfather was one of the 6 young men that discovered the site of the crash and rescued the alien and nursed him back to health because he was hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And then he left and he started living among us as a human being. He was able to do that.
You said that this being, how did they describe the being first, and how was he able to pass among humans?
He was human-like, apparently. And that's why he was able to continue telling them his story later, after he had already become absorbed into the human race, because he left the reservation after he came back to health. And he continued the story. His name was Bekti, they discovered,
Mm-hmm.
and gave them the whole story of human existence on this planet.
Where was he from?
Morningsky
did they
never
say?
discussed that. He never disclosed that.
But he was more human, not reptilian human,
No,
but
not
human.
reptilian.
Robert was getting this from his grandfather, who was present at the time, and he was present to the stories as they were being relayed in the day?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the information, starting with the place he called the Green World.
The Green World was in this galaxy, apparently, and we don't know exactly which planet it was. Morningsky refers to it as the Green World.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the nexus, that was the original home world of the reptilian species that we now call the reptilians. And according to Morningsky, it really started with dragonflies.
Mm-hmm.
And the dragonflies over millions of years evolved into what we now refer to as reptilians, scaly-skinned, humanoid-looking beings. And they retained some of the characteristics of the dragonflies. However, they did have wings, and they were able to fly, and this was a tremendous advantage in their battles, which were many. And because they were able to attack an enemy flying as a host, and Morningsky describes it as an angry buzz coming from them until they were upon their enemy, and then they were very difficult to defeat.
Fast and vicious and had claws and all the above.
Yes, they had claws,
Mm-hmm.
and so they became all powerful on the Green World, and they went through several phases on the Green World. Eventually, they began to evolve into more, not quite as ferocious and warlike as they were business-like. And what they originally relied on to dominate in terms of ferocity now became business acumen, and they became money-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And it became a commercial. Their civilization became more commercial.
So in your book, you talk about not only money systems, but they have colonial kind of practices throughout the solar system. They also use war and assassinations and sport games. And I thought, pretty much sounds like us. I mean, is it that bad everywhere?
It does sound like us, and I think the reason it sounds like us is because we have derived a lot of that from them,
Mm-hmm.
because of their influence here on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
So we've become mercenary and combative in business just like they were, just like they developed those same capabilities.
So let's talk about what happened on the Greenland. There's quite a bit written in your book about what happened with the reproduction capabilities of the species, with the females who ultimately gained dominance, with their inability to reproduce at one point. Explain that whole lineage
Well,
to us.
as the reptilians became more aware of technology and learned how to fly to their moons and to inhabit their moons and to mine their moons, they gradually started to go out into the cosmos. They developed spacefaring technology. And since they were a very fierce race, they had no trouble conquering the entities that they encountered wherever they went. And so they really developed an empire.
But why? What was the motivation?
That's the way they are. They have no other modus operandi. All they know how to do is to dominate. They're not a peace-loving people. That's the key. That's one of the key attributes of the reptilians is they really have nothing that we would recognize as a heart or love.
Right.
Okay, or affection. They don't have those capabilities. They just don't. That's the way they're made. So all they know about when they encounter another civilization on a distant star is how do we dominate them and make them our slaves. And that's been what they've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps millions of years. Their encounter with human beings began in the constellation of Lyra. That was the first time that humans and reptilians met, and Alex Collier tells that whole story in his book, Defending Sacred Ground, and that's a book I would recommend highly.
Okay,
Yeah.
good, thank you.
And Alex is tremendous. He's a good writer and everything, and he knows the whole story because he's connected to the Andromedans, and the Andromedans, of course, know everything about this.
And so let's talk about the beings, the Lyen beings. Okay, we can go into the trajectory of Mars and to Earth, but let's look at where the reptilians finally made it here, where the crossbreeding started and so forth. Just paint that picture.
When it came to actually developing stable societies of the entities that they had defeated in battle, they left that to the females. The females were the ones that actually devised the systems for controlling the populations of these planets.
Did it happen through crossbreeding?
No, the
They just
females
knew
were
how to
just adept.
dominate.
The females were just adept at that, and so they did all the work that was necessary to keep
Subdue a species.
keep the conquered peoples in line and fearful and controlled and contributing their labor, which was that's what they did. They were enslaved. Eventually, it became rather than just simple enslavement. They realized that enslaving conquered populations was not the right way to go. They would simply let them develop their own society and contribute money. Okay, just
Introduce a monetary system.
introduce the monetary system and banking as they developed, and that's how they controlled those societies. And the females were the ones who were drafted to do that kind of work, while the males went back out into space and conquered a few more star systems.
Then now let's start on the rest of that story. So the males are out conquering. Here you have planet Earth. We have an Earth with a newly developing species.
Yeah, before we get there, though, we have to talk about the fact that the females began to realize that they really were the most important. They were more important.
This is where they become dominant.
That's right.
Right, okay,
They were more important. They were running these star systems. They were supervising. And they finally realized, well, why shouldn't we have the supreme power? Why should the king be in charge? And they revolted, and instead of a king, they replaced the king with a queen. But now the female warriors also joined in that. And the reason for that was that they reached a point where they started to encounter civilizations that resisted and weren't as easy to defeat. And they had to do something to change the system. So they said, why don't we recruit female warriors too? Well, while they were developing their civilizations in Draco, primarily in Draco, which is a star system about 300 light years from us, the humans in this galaxy were developing a civilization in the star system Lyra. Now, Sverdlow doesn't know how the humans got here. He doesn't know how the reptilians got here in this galaxy. He does talk about how the reptilians evolved from the dragonfly, but he doesn't really know how they got into this particular galaxy. They just appeared full grown, so to speak. And the humans were the same. They just appeared. They could have come from another dimension. They could have come from another star system. They could have come from another time period.
Mm-hmm. That's where Adamski's work comes in that's very interesting, because he said with his contact with Venusians and such, the information he was given is that this humanoid form, the human form, is the most useful and popular in terms of the vehicles for incarnating into throughout the universe. That is a very common, we're a very common form.
Yes, now, but in those early stages, the Lyra was the only place the humans existed. The human race existed on planets in the star system of Lyra. Mm-hmm. And they had a very peaceful civilizations. They developed agriculture, they traded with each other, and eventually they also developed spacefaring technology. Mm-hmm. And they were living very peacefully. There were millions of them, and I don't know how many planets they had in Lyra, but there were several. And one day, the reptilians appeared in the sky and decided they would like to find out more about these human beings. And at first they were friendly, but then they somehow felt insulted by the way the Lyrans regarded them, and they started to kill them. Mm-hmm. And they destroyed 50 million Lyrans, and they destroyed 3 of their planets. They had the technology to actually destroy planets.
Oh, this huge starship, the Queen's starship, the way it's described in
your
book, it looks like Death Star, an all-seeing eye that vaporizes whole cities and small planets that are in the way.
Yeah, they developed, the Death Star was developed, that George Lucas talked about, was developed by the reptilians as a weapon. And it made sense to have a globular configuration and a planetary configuration as a spaceship than some sleek aerodynamic thing, because they could live inside the planet while they're traveling through space. Mm-hmm. And they did that.
Right.
And they could keep their animals with them, their agriculture with them, in the planet.
So now they're attacking the peaceful Lyrans.
The Lyrans were unprepared for such a catastrophe. It was truly a holocaust, and they created a human diaspora in the galaxy. The humans spread to 110 different star systems eventually, many of whom developed spacefaring technology, and many of them who did not. They particularly inhabited the Pleiades, mm-hmm. And Procyon and several other star systems. And eventually they continued to connect with each other, and they developed something that we now refer to as a federation. Some call it the Galactic Federation, some call it the Collective, some call it the Federation of Light, but
it's uniquely human DNA.
It's a human thing. And they started to learn how to repel the reptilian attacks, and they became good at it. The reptilians left a lot of them alone as they developed these other colonies and other star systems. And but the reptilians was so their spacefaring technology was so advanced they could go anywhere, and they eventually discovered a lot of the human habitats, but they were repelled by them because the humans did learn how to develop the weaponry to do that. And some of the humans wound up here in this solar system. Mm-hmm. And at the time they came here, which I think Sverdlow said was about 2 or 3 million years ago, they inhabited 2 planets, Mars and a planet now that we now refer to as Maldek, mm-hmm. which was the 4th planet from the sun. And they lived peacefully too, just like they had in Lyra, and developed trading with each other, developed agricultural societies. They were not warlike at all. And then one day, guess who showed up?
Our favorite.
The reptilians.
Reptilians, yeah.
When they came to the solar system, they brought their dinosaurs with them.
Okay, now that's interesting to me. How does that, because I noted that and I thought, but, according to science, the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago, way before they would have come. So you're saying they brought some more with them, or?
What we call the Jurassic Period, supposedly started 265 million years ago, mm-hmm. and terminated all of a sudden 65 million years ago. That's based on carbon dating. Carbon dating is notoriously unreliable. Sverdlov's time frame is different. He claims that they came here about 1 million years ago.
Who came here?
To this solar system.
The reptilians came here.
Yes.
That's pretty new to the game.
There were no humans here when they got here.
All the different researchers and viewers doing this stuff are trying to peer into an era where time wasn't the same, the frequencies of the dimension itself wasn't the same, and I can see where this gets very confusing in these long time frames. The Vedas are far, far longer than that, for example.
According to Sverdlov's timetable, the humans did inhabit Mars and Maldek before the reptilians arrived here, and were living peacefully on those two planets, on the surface of those two planets. And when the reptilians showed up here, they destroyed Maldek immediately, either with a weapon or just by simply going by so close to it that it exploded. And millions of humans on Maldek died. A lot of them were able to get off and go to Mars. But when the Death Star, which Sverdlov refers to as a Death Star, went by Mars, it stripped the atmosphere of much of its oxygen. So the Martians were forced to retreat underground. So the Maldekians that survived also joined the Martians underground on Mars when Maldek was destroyed. And of course, the destruction of Maldek supposedly created the asteroid belt that we call now the asteroid belt. The reptilians went on then and encountered Earth, which at that time was a water planet, according to Sverdlov's technology time frame. And they were able to dry it out. They went into a mutual orbit around the Earth with their Death Star, dried it out, and the water sort of congealed at the polar regions. And out of that water, out of those oceans, emerged two continents, which we refer to as Lemuria and Atlantis. And then they created supposedly a moon, which is artificial. Our moon is artificial, because it was easier to inhabit Earth from a moon that was closer than from Venus. They in turn became the third planet from the sun. Their Death Star became a planet, Venus, and they inhabited the Earth. And they settled on Lemuria. And they lived on Lemuria by themselves for around 300,000 years.
Yeah, and that's again where the stories, so many different stories come into this, because the other body of stories say that they were peace-loving as they were developing this very early development, peace-loving humans there at that time. Is it possible we're now dropping into something called maybe parallel timelines, parallel realities?
No, I don't think so. I'll tell you why. Because by that time, the Federation was well developed. And many of the Federation star systems had spacefaring technology and advanced weaponry. So they were quite able to defend themselves and to help each other. The 110 different star systems now became a federation, a true federation, and they traded and they helped each other with technology and with education. So at that point, the Federation decided they were not going to let the reptilians have this particular solar system. And so they sent a fierce group of humans that we call the Atlans, A-T-L-A-N-S, to inhabit the other continent on this planet, and that became Atlantis.
But they were human.
They were humans. But they were the early humans. They were originated in the Lyran star system. They were not created on this planet. They were basically extraterrestrials. Being pre-human, as we refer to human, they did not have the reptilian brain. But we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
In any case, the Atlans were unhappy with the dinosaurs chomping over their agricultural settlements, and they went to war with the reptilians. And they had very sophisticated weaponry. They had what I think Sverdlov calls electromagnetic pulse weapons, which they used to cause Lemuria to sink beneath the Pacific Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And the reptilians then retreated underground on this planet. And the humans had the planet surface to themselves. And they were able to develop a golden civilization that we call Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And they had tremendous technology, tremendous resources. They were very spiritual in the beginning.
In the beginning.
And they were very loving and helpful, and
Yes.
they were very powerful
And
race.
agrarian, very
Yeah.
beautiful.
The reptilians decided that the best way to get the surface back was through hybridization. And they're very good at this. They've used that system throughout the galaxy to defeat to defeat 21 different star systems. They've used it. So they started abducting humans from Atlantis,
Mm-hmm.
creating hybrids. The hybrids were then planted back into Atlantean society, and they began to develop.
That's the reptilian brain and such was,
No, there was no
Not
reptilian.
yet?
No.
okay.
But they took over the key positions of the levers of power.
Mm-hmm.
What we now call, during World War II, we call it the fifth column.
Mm-hmm.
In the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish generals had 4 columns of troops, and they referred to the fifth column as being already infiltrated in the population.
I see.
And they were weakening it from within. So the fifth column started to infiltrate Atlantean society to the point where they felt they could now come in and take over Atlantis. But in any case, the Atlanteans began to realize that the threat was not from above, it was from below.
Mm-hmm.
And they started pointing their weapons downward instead of upward, and the pulse weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And that destabilized Atlantis, the continent, and the whole continent became unstable.
Yes, yes.
And the black magic sort of contributed to that problem, and allied with the volcanic activity, Atlantis began to sink itself. Prior to the sinking of Atlantis, the main portion of which sank in one night, as everyone knows now, they were warned by their
They knew.
yes, by their psychics and
Mm-hmm.
by their advanced beings.
Well,
They-
it was the
they-
third time. This went down in stages.
Went down in stages.
It started going down from the north to the midsection and finally the south, which was by then much more of a
Posi-
warring condition.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
and the island of Poseidon was the main feature. By the way, prior to that sinking, colonies left Atlantis and started colonies like in Greece. The early Grecians were a colony of Atlantis.
Right.
That's why they were really very similar to the Atlanteans in many ways. But they were a breakaway civilization, and the Atlanteans went to war with them to recover them. They didn't like the fact that they had gone away. But so that also started the Mediterranean civilizations.
Well, then you have the whole Egyptian culture.
And
and
you got the whole
Sumerian.
Egyptian. And so there was also a mass migration to Egypt. That was
Yes,
the main one.
that was the main
And that
one,
was
yes.
led by a high priest called Thoth, Thoth. And
Well, then again, when you get back to alternate timelines, the Hermetics will say that Egypt existed concurrently with Atlantis over a period of a couple 100,000 years up to date currently. So there was always an exchange back and forth of these cultures,
right.
right? And that changes the way we view the whole thing. If we understand that, if they had advanced knowledge, each time Atlantis was to be destroyed in stages, they had these immigrations, mass immigrations all along to
Yes.
South America, the Yucatan, even Europe and
Yes,
Egypt.
to the Yucatan, that's right. Central America, South America, and Egypt and Greece. By the time Atlantis actually sank, so many of them had left and migrated to other places that human civilizations sprung up in those places. But the war continued between the reptilians and the humans. There was a council called in the galaxy of Andromeda to decide on how to reconcile the two civilizations on this planet, how to cease the warfare and evolve a peaceful civilization on this planet. And at that council, they decided that they were going to create a new race, and it would be part human and part reptilian. The humans, of course, did not want that any part of the reptilian DNA. But 12 human civilizations were combined with some reptilian DNA as part of the deal. The most active human race involved in that were the Elohim. They were humans from a very distant star system but they were humans who had originated on Lyra. So that's how the human race was created, according to Sverdlov's timeline, around 40 or 50,000 years ago, in what became the Garden of Eden in northern Iraq. Truly.
So let's talk about this, 50-50 hybrid and what they're doing
They became
here.
the royalty that we know as European royalty because they had a larger admixture of reptilian DNA. And the reason they call them blue bloods was because they have more copper in their system.
Yes.
And the copper turns the blood somewhat bluish. And so they became known as blue bloods. And they were in charge of all of the basic civilizations in Europe and all over the planet. The blue bloods basically have controlled our civilization for thousands of years now.
Mm-hmm.
And the reptilians keep us, the population, in a dumbed-down state because they know that we have the capability of expanding our consciousness and eventually reaching into the higher dimensions, which they can't do.
They can't do.
They can't do that.
Mm-mm. They don't have the refinement.
So we have the capability, and that's why they're afraid of us.
Right.
They know that. And the Federation is helping us to grow up, to expand our consciousness. So that's the game we're in now. It's a stalemate, really. If the human consciousness can expand enough before the hybrid population reaches the point of takeover, and we also have to talk about the robotics part of this.
Oh yeah, and the transhumanist part.
It's also reptilian based.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they control technology,
Mm-hmm.
they control the media, they control Hollywood. The Illuminati are running the planet now.
Yeah.
But as our consciousness expands, and the Federation is helping us, but they cannot interfere
Mm-hmm.
because of the non-interference clause in the galactic
Yeah, I
law, whatever you want
understand.
to call it. They can't directly interfere, but they can help to educate us. And one of the appendices in my book is the path to victory. That particular appendix was dictated by an extraterrestrial by the name of Kyla, K-H-Y-L-A, who was from the star system Procyon, which was a human star system until the Greys took it over. And they took it over through subterfuge and infiltration until finally the human population was totally dominated and had to leave. So he's a refugee from that system. And so he dictated this particular appendix in my book. And what he said was, once we've learned to focus on our highest spiritual nature and keep it in focus, we'll reach the point where they can't touch us anymore.
I absolutely agree with that. And as you say, it's a little bit of a race against time. And is that your purpose for writing the book?
Yeah, the purpose was to here we
So
are.
here's the threat. This is how long it's been going on, right?
Yeah. And this is what we have to do. This is what we have to do now, or we're going to lose the planet, essentially. And it'll become another slave planet of the reptilian empire.
In my last conversation with Len Kasten, we covered some of the political and military times of the 1960s surrounding a secret mission to send human beings to a distant planet as part of an exchange program. In this talk, Len discusses the mission itself and what the exchange was about. They gave us technology. I don't know what we gave them, but we will find out. Let's talk about the setting up of the people to go to it. We talked about it a little bit last time. Now, December 1963, Los Alamos received a message from the about their landing on Earth. This was just weeks after Kennedy's death, as I recall. Was it just after or just before Kennedy's
No, the
death?
exchange program was set up in the 50s.
Yes, but I'm talking about that communication in the 60s that came through.
Yes. Kennedy was briefed on it by the CIA and in the early 60s when he took over, and then he approved it, naturally. He wanted a space triumph desperately after Sputnik, and it had already asked von Braun when we could send somebody to the moon and do something on the moon. And Lyndon Johnson was brought in on it because Kennedy had made him the space council head.
After Kennedy's death, he was brought in,
No,
right?
no, Kennedy had appointed him as head of the space council.
But he didn't know about the project
He did not
yet.
know about the
Right,
project.
right. Okay, so there we are, and now, April 24th, 1964. Two craft landed near Sirocco. Let's start there. What happened after that?
No, the first craft, they sent two craft into our atmosphere, April 24th, 1964. One of them, the first one, went to the wrong place. It landed outside of Corona. Was it Corona? I believe it was Corona, New Mexico. It was about 100 miles away
Right.
from where it was
Slightly
headed.
off target, yeah.
And do you know anything about the Lyen Zamora case?
No.
You know that a New Mexico policeman was called on an emergency call because an alien craft had landed near Corona, New Mexico. His name was Patrolman Lyen Zamora. And the
It's
date-
coming back. I've read bits about it. Yes, go
And the
ahead.
date was April 24th, 1964.
Okay.
That was the alien craft that missed the landing place. And what he encountered was two aliens standing outside the craft, which he said was egg-shaped and very large, very
Yeah,
large.
yeah.
And then when they saw him, they scrambled and got back in and took off. That was the one that was supposed to have landed at Holloman Air Force Base and missed it. But then we sent a message to that craft. They eventually found the right place. But see how that Zamora incident ties
Yes.
in with Serpo.
Yes. Okay. So once the contact was made, now this is 1964. Tell us about some of the prep and how they were kind of managing the logistics for this operation.
Oh, in terms of training the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they put an ad in many military journals asking for volunteers. Didn't tell them anything about it, just that it was a dangerous mission, and they got 600 replies, and they eventually narrowed it down to 16.
And these
And
guys,
some of them, and there were 2 women in the original cut.
but not in the final
Not in the
12.
final.
There was some misunderstanding
Right,
about
not
that.
in the final cut.
Okay, and now they were taken to the hospitable quarters of Fort Leavenworth prison, right?
The security was so fanatical and so compartmentalized that the DIA didn't want to risk, who was in charge of the program, did not want to risk any possibility of it leaking out, to the point where they didn't want people with families, they didn't want people with children, they didn't want people they wanted them to be orphans themselves. And these men were going to be gone for 10 years, don't forget, so they were concerned. And so they selected them very carefully. A guy from MI6 in England was part of this program, and he sent in a letter to the website saying that they had trouble filling all the 12 positions with the right categories, physicians, scientists. They had to actually go out and recruit a couple of them. They couldn't find them all within the military community. They did have to go out and recruit some of them.
So
which
they have
did.
their final 16, and how were they trained? How does one train for going into outer space and then living on a foreign planet that really we have no knowledge of?
Well, we already had NASA at that point. They were supposedly in charge of anything to do with outer space, but they were not involved in this program at all.
Right,
They did get involved in the training.
yeah.
These men were not trained as astronauts.
So let's talk
No.
about what their actual training
They
was
were
like.
given, the subject matter was very wide, everything you can think of. Astronomy, everything that they thought they might need to know was covered. And many of the people that trained them did come forward later and send in anonymous submissions to the website. And that really helped to flesh out the information on the Serpo website. But they were sent to Fort Peary, Virginia, which was the CIA training facility, commonly known as the farm. In any case, they had their own facility within the farm. And so they were in a separate, even more secure location. And that's where they were trained mainly. But they were also sent to foreign countries for training, Chile, Mexico, and they were sent to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida for the high altitude training. So they got a very wide kind of training for this.
But what was the training like for their physical bodies?
We knew they had the right kind of atmosphere. We knew they had carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, just like we do. We knew that already. Don't forget, we had been dealing with them for 9 years prior to Kennedy's advent. So we knew a lot. We had volumes of information about their planet that they'd already given us. They did send the 4 aliens with the craft to help us back engineer the craft. So presumably we knew a lot about them, even though we couldn't communicate fluently with them. First landing in April, as we discussed, April 24th, 1964, they decided they didn't want to take the 12 people with them at that time. We greeted them with a greeting party of 16 officials from the government. I don't believe that President Johnson was among them. The 16 people have not been identified, but they were high officials in military and intelligence community, and probably MJ-12. That's my guess, I'm sure. And I think possibly Anonymous was one of them. In any case, they presented us with two gifts. One was a automatic translator that we could type into, and we could see their language on it, and they could see our language, and they could communicate that way. They brought those with them. They also presented us with a gift to the people of Earth called the Yellow Book.
Yes.
The Yellow Book was an amazing piece of technology that wasn't really a book. It was maybe, it looked like a book, but really as you opened it, images sprang out of it, holographic images of what you were looking at, and giving you pictures that were of historical significance going back to 2000 BC.
I loved the description of this. And this particular piece of technology, does it exist today? Does the military still have?
Yes, they have it, of course.
And does it show into the future as well, or only the past?
As far as I know, it just discussed the past. But the remarkable thing about the book was that when you held it close to you, it picked up the language that was in your aura,
Yeah.
and communicated with you in that language. And it supposedly had 80 different languages encoded into it. So if you thought in terms of English, you would read English.
That's a beautiful gift.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay, so now at what point, now 1964, they decided not to take them with them at this
Yes.
time, so then what happened?
They took the 11 bodies of Ebens that had died here.
Mhm.
There were 6 in the second crash. The Roswell crash was actually a collision between two of their craft. They were both identical in terms of the same race. When Reagan was briefed on it, they told him that they were the same exact race from both crashes. One crashed near Datil, New Mexico, and the other one crashed outside of Socorro. And that was the one we recovered. And there were 6 on the one from Datil. There were 4 dead aliens at Socorro and 1 live one. So they took back a total of 11 bodies with them on that landing of April.
And were they stored in the way that Corso mentioned, where they were suspended in some kind of fluid to keep them from degenerating?
Yes. At that time, Los Alamos had developed a cryogenic facility to preserve bodies indefinitely. That was involved with cooling, I guess, supercooling, I'm not sure what.
Mm-hmm.
But we had also autopsied several of them.
So the film Alien Autopsy, the most well-known film called Alien Autopsy?
The Alien Autopsy film was based on the crash that occurred before Roswell. Those aliens were different. They had 6 fingers and toes. They looked more human than the Ebens did.
The media has poo-pooed this. It's been...
The autopsy, yes, that autopsy film was the real thing. And I think that the guy that briefed President Reagan said that. He verified that. He validated that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've taken their bodies back with them. And what is the plan to return and pick up the
They said
humans?
they would come back in a year.
Mm-hmm. And what happened to this crew? They'd been trained already.
It was an enormous logistics problem for us because we had 40 tons of equipment sitting there waiting to be loaded onto the alien craft, including 3 Jeeps, 10 motorcycles, an incredible amount of stuff. And all that had to be warehoused now. And the 12 Americans were sitting in a bus waiting, and they were told they had to go back to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which was a prison,
Right.
and wait there so they wouldn't be able to contact anybody. And we treated them like prisoners, basically.
The ships finally did come. And let's
Yes,
talk about the ships, what happened when they landed, the crew, and then just going on board, kind of getting comfortable.
Right, and what was amazing about that, when the ship finally arrived in July, I think it was 16th of 1965, this one landed at the Nevada test site, not at Holloman. The first one was at Holloman, was actually on the border of Holloman and White Sands Proving Ground.
Okay.
The second one came directly to the Nevada test site, which is right near Area 51. They wanted to be near Area 51. At that time, Area 51 did exist. That one landed there, and much like in the movie Close Encounters, the 12 men were taken on board at that point. And what was amazing about that was that the craft was large enough to take the 40 tons. The shuttlecraft that landed was large enough to take the 40 tons of equipment, but they took it all in one move. So evidently they had anti-gravity technology.
Apparently, yeah.
In effect, they were able to, it was all on one platform, all of it.
Yes, that was shocking.
The 10 motorbike.
And all their food and supplies.
And food and everything,
yeah.
yes. All went on in one smooth move.
So their cargo's on board, the people are on board. What was the first experience in terms of the chain of command? Who were the beings that greeted them, and what was that experience like for them?
Yes, well, of course, they still couldn't communicate language-wise, but they did have somebody designated as a communicator.
A female, right?
A female, they call EVE number 2.
Mm-hmm.
She spoke English pretty well. Evidently, her vocal cords were okay to speak the language. And we found out they had certain people on Serpo that could also speak English.
Mm-hmm.
But they were mainly in the mainly doctors and people who were in the educated bracket.
Mm-hmm. And this female really was to remain their very close ally and companion, more than just a translator. It seemed the way she was depicted was she was quite compassionate and open with them.
And the commander was very taken with her. He was very pleased that she was so compassionate and so caring.
Mm-hmm.
She was like a combination hostess, translator, guide, all of those things wrapped into one. And she was the one that had translated that portion of the Yellow Book to English. She was the one that did that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Eben 2.
Eben number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And the 12 men got on board the shuttlecraft, and they were taken in, they were put in bubbles. Well, that portion of the trip, they weren't in the bubbles yet.
Mm-mm.
They were taken to the mothership in the shuttlecraft, which was very large in itself, by the way, and that was the one that had landed at the Zamora incident.
Okay.
And if you look at paintings of that incident, that craft doesn't appear to be especially large, but it was large enough to take the 40 tons of equipment with it. And but when they got to the mothership, they were astounded because the commander said in his diary that he was standing in a room with a ceiling that was about 100 feet high. It was huge.
Yeah.
The mothership was huge.
And so they were told from the beginning that they had access to wander the ship to go where they.
Not at that point.
That was later.
Initially, they were put in individual little.
Yeah, the little pods, bubbles.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, that were attached to the floor, to electronics in the floor, so they could be monitored.
Mm-hmm.
And if they stepped outside of those bubbles, they got sick.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to. Also, they were saying that the sound of the Eben's voice would make some of them nauseous and even dizzy.
Yeah, the
tones that were coming out of them.
Yeah, there was screeching, like screeching sounds.
Mm-hmm.
It was very weird.
Mm-hmm.
And it said it sounded like high-pitched singing, is
Mm-hmm.
what the commander said in his diary. And so they were kept in those bubbles during the takeoff, and if they went outside of it, they did get sick. For the whole first half of the journey, they were mainly in those bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost all track of time. They didn't have their backpacks with them. All their equipment was in another part of the ship. The commander was frustrated by the fact that he couldn't get to those backpacks because he wanted to look at them, but they had to just do with what they had.
And they were given food that was from the Ebens as well, not just their own food. They did run out at one point, right? This was a 10-month journey.
No, the sea rations...
Did they last the whole time?
They lasted the whole time.
But they were eating Eben food too.
But they were trying to eat the Eben food. They said it tasted like paper.
Paper.
Yeah.
But it also had an effect of, seemed like a healing effect when things started going wrong in their body. Some of these foods started balancing them out again, whatever they were.
Well, no, what healed and helped them with the illness was one of the Ebens would pass a blue,
I remember that, yeah.
blue light over them, and then they got much better after
Yeah,
that.
light technology.
Yeah.
And now these guys were traveling for 10 months, 39 light years away, which would have been, as I think you said, 40 times the speed of light.
That's right.
So the implication there is they were transiting through what we would call wormholes.
Wormholes.
So there was a time-space effect going on here.
Yes. They found out later they also had antimatter technology, but the antimatter technology was not what they used to travel through the wormholes.
Okay.
They traveled through a wormhole is instantaneous. It would have to be for them to have covered that
To
vast
collapse the
distance.
time to that extent, yeah.
10 months. Once they got to the midway point, when one of the commanders, one of the Ebens told them they were at the halfway point, they allowed them to walk around the ship freely and ask questions, do anything they wanted to do.
Once you're acclimated.
Yeah. And I think the only times they really got sick is when they were going through the wormholes.
That's what I was just going to ask next. The team commander wrote, "We will all feel better when the craft gets out of this time wave." Is how they understood
He knew
it.
even then it was a time wave. Yes. Yeah.
And then they would go, whenever they needed to, back into these bowls of protection. But then time, the whole notion of time. Now, he was there to chronicle their travels, but he began, you could see in the diary, he said, I don't know when the last time I wrote was. They were all beginning to lose track of time, because it was time passing at this point very differently for them then?
Yeah, subjectively speaking, I think he was not experiencing time the way we would experience time. And he looked at his watch, and it said so-and-so, and he thought, well, maybe one day has passed, but he didn't know. It might have been 3 days.
Well, this apparently was part of the problem in the timing of the mission. They ended up overstaying their original plan by a few years because I guess they lost track of time.
They lost track of time. They brought with them timepieces on batteries, and the batteries ran out. They tried coordinating with the Eben orbit of 43 days around their sun, whereas ours was 43 hours, whereas we were on a 24-hour.
Yeah.
They had to make those computations. It got complicated, and
Just hell with it. I think it was a day or two
we'll
ago.
Just use even time.
Yeah.
Just use even time. That's what they decided to do.
Yeah, which is interesting. We don't stop and think about, obviously they didn't either. They didn't know what to expect. Okay, so one of them was in the engine room. Let's talk about what the engine room was described as on the craft.
Well, they saw these pipes leading to a central location, and they saw like an energy source coming down to that central location, and they realized that there was no sound, so whatever it was energetic. They didn't understand how it worked, okay? But they did know they also were using antimatter, and Bob Lazar did mention that. Have you talked to Bob Lazar?
No, I have not.
He mentioned that the aliens had an element called element 115.
Yes.
Which is not
heavier than our yeah.
Not native to our planet.
Yeah.
And that's what they used for the antimatter part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So they did use that also. So I think Lazar was validated when it comes to that.
This is where it gets kind of sticky, is one of the team members died.
Yes.
On the journey. I mean, it was a bit of an incident.
It was an incident. They were all given 3-digit numbers as new identities.
Yes.
This one was number 308, was his identity. He was actually one of the pilots. They had 2 pilots, a commander, an assistant commander, 2 scientists, 2 doctors, et cetera. They had it all worked out. This one was the pilot, number 308. Supposedly, the commander discovered that he was dead only because his bubble was unoccupied when he walked around. He didn't see anybody in there. He said he only counted 11 people. And finally, they told him that he had died turned out to be a pulmonary embolism. Mm-hmm. And so 308 was dead, but where was the body? He wasn't told where the body was, and he didn't inquire further at that point because he assumed that the body was in a temporary or location.
The holding area somewhere.
It would be turned over to them when they got to Serpo, but that never happened.
Well, they found out the body had actually been autopsied and closely examined?
After a while, the commander asked again when they got there, where is 308's body? The commander said it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, even said it doesn't exist anymore. He said, we were honored to have it to use for our experiments, and we have used it to clone another type of creature that's part alien, part human.
So that would bring me to, kind of a segue question about the Ebens themselves. What was were they cloning their own species as part of the population? And also, what was their process of reproduction?
Our people did snoop around. They were asked not to, but they did snoop around and to find out how they reproduced. They looked in on some of the huts that they lived in, and said that it was very much like ours. But it was, kind of different too.
Let's talk about how they lived, because I think most people want to know what, they want to have a glimpse of a life from another planet. So let's talk about food supplies. Let's talk about what the environment was like. They had 2 suns, for example. So
2 suns in the sky, so it never got dark. They had a twilight. The Americans had a difficult time getting used to that.
Yes.
The fact that it never got dark, and they had to plan their days accordingly to have 8 or 9 hours of rest, even though it was light outside. And they worked that out. I think the planet revolved around one of the suns, the larger one. The other one was off in the distance, and it was there all the time. So that was why it was never dark.
Right, and when you go to twilight, it was, depending on the rotation of the other sun,
Right.
Around the other sun.
And it's been debatable whether or not the 2 suns actually revolved around
We're
each
kind
other.
of in a binary
But my understanding
pattern.
was they were not.
They were not, okay.
They were not.
So what was the landscape like? What were the temperatures like, and so forth?
Well, when the doors opened and they walked out onto the planet, the first reaction of the commander was, "God, what a planet!" It was just like he said, New Mexico or Arizona, sparse desert dirt, what it was basically, and the heat was overwhelming. It was about I think they figured it was about 140 degrees, something like that.
How did these guys contend with it?
They took them into an underground place that was cooler, and that's where they stayed. And that's where they put all the equipment under the ground, and so they could tolerate it that way.
And was it always that temperature then? That was a constant?
That was the equatorial region, yes.
Now, that wasn't the only region. There
No.
was another region on the planet. Let's talk about the north.
But the Ebens preferred that climate.
The warm one.
They preferred to live on yes, they liked the heat.
Okay, let's talk about the other environment.
Well, after a while, when they started to explore the planet, they found that the northern quadrant was very, very reasonably, temperatures were fine. They were much better.
Trees,
verdant, water, mountains. They said it looked like Montana, and they named it Little Montana. Little Montana. And they loved it up there. People loved it up there. But they lived in the hot portion of the planet for about 6 or 7 years. Eventually they said, why can't we just live up there? And they said, fine, we'll build you a community, and they did. They built the community especially for our people.
Now, were all of these plants and trees and such native to that planet?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't like they brought those back with body parts and were creating something. No. Okay.
No, they looked like fir trees.
Yeah, exactly.
I put a photo in the book of the Montana climate.
Yes.
And they said that it looked pretty much like that. Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about some of the animals they encountered.
Yeah, they encountered some strange-looking animals. One looked like a lion, but it had a lot of fur around its face. And there was something that looked like an armadillo. And that turned out to be dangerous, the armadillo. But they were instructed not to try and kill them. By the way, they had brought guns with them.
Of course.
Revolvers and rifles both. They were told not to. And
Don't kill any of our species,
right. But they wanted, the Americans did want some source of meat, which they weren't getting.
Because they're vegetarian.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, the Ebens did not have any concept of killing animals to eat them at all. So they encountered a creature that looked like a snake.
Right.
But it had very unusual eyes, and they did kill the snake. They did kill it, and they dissected the eyes, and the eyes, they said, were almost like human eyes.
Yes, that was freaky reading about that.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And but they were allowed to explore the entire planet.
And so they were allowed to eat the snake meat?
Yeah, on that particular occasion, but they told them not to do it again. They said, don't do it again.
Yeah.
We don't like you to do that.
Yeah.
Please don't do it again.
And so let's talk a little bit about the food supplies that they did encounter there.
They grew food, as we would call it, hydroponically, in a very artificial environment where they had soil and they had water. And I think, at that time, I don't think we had hydroponics on this planet. I'm not sure that we did.
In the 60s, that would have been a bit early.
Yeah.
We did by the 70s, but
Yeah, well, maybe some of that came from them.
maybe.
A lot of technology did come from that trip. And maybe we learned about hydroponics from them.
Mm-hmm.
They had to wear, when they went into the hydroponics facility, the person in charge told them not to come in because they weren't wearing anything on their head. She got EBE number 2, who said that you have to wear something on your head. And she went and got them hats to wear while they went through that particular facility. But, so they grew the food that way.
A lot of it was, again, tasteless to the
Yes.
Americans, although some of the fruits, it sounded like, were pretty decent and sweet.
Yes, exactly. The fruit was the closest thing that we could come with. The rest of it, they said,
Paper.
tasted like paper.
But again, they said some of those foods, those bland foods, were used in healing them when they weren't feeling well, when
Yeah,
they're
that's right.
nauseous and all.
They did say that, yeah.
Yes.
They did say that. So the foods were nourishing, and of course the Ebens could get all they wanted. They didn't have to buy anything. There was no money. There was
No money in the
concept-
culture. I think a lot of people would, yeah,
No concept of money.
yeah. Yeah, there you go. That's a good
Yeah,
one.
Right.
Causes a lot of suffering.
Yeah, exactly. They had a central facility where the Ebens could go and take anything they wanted. That they needed.
And they continued using the light for healing purposes and such. Light was really primary to what they did.
Yeah, they did, exactly. And
Using frequencies.
we tried to teach them our science. They weren't terribly interested in it. They took a radio telephone apart to show them how it worked, and they were surprised that it was so different from what they knew. When they put them in their quarters, when they arrived, they had light and they had power. And our people were able to plug anything we had into their boxes, and it worked.
Yeah.
It all worked. We found out later why that was the case, because what they called the crystal rectangle was taken back to Earth and analyzed. But anyway...
What did we find out from the crystal
we
rectangle?
found out that there was like a small little bubble of antimatter that reacted to any demand put on it.
How are we using
that
that
now?
now?
50 volts, it got 50 volts. If it needed 10 volts, it got 10 volts.
Perfect. How are we using it? Do we know? I mean, it's obviously being used probably in some exotic military technology, or...
If we have that technology, just think of all of the things that would revolutionize.
Well, don't we?
We must. We must have it.
And so, yeah, I think
The
that's
Ebens-
the holy
Ebens
grail.
shared everything with us freely. That would
So,
explain it.
any final thoughts? We're out of time.
I think that the Serpo story opens a door that, if we could truly admit to it, would be tremendous in terms of opening the whole story. Because it was put with the DIA and not the CIA, it's a hole into the ability, into this information
Yes.
that we need to really get into, and perhaps this will start it, hopefully.
Well, I wish you the best of luck in your Freedom of Information Act journey. That should be fun.
I'll need it. I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, you might feel beaten up by the end of that
Yeah.
one, but thank you for what you've already done. It was just absolutely enthralling.
It's been fun. I'm glad we would do this.
There's so much more to the story. You can find out about it in the book Secret Journey to Planet Serpo. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on Gaiam TV.